Our next panel is called Faith Under Siege, and I would like to invite to the stage the moderator of the panel, Sonia Soltus, market head in Ukraine, APCO Worldwide.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Before we get started, we would very much like everyone to stand for a moment of silence in commemoration of all the Ukrainians who have lost their lives fighting for freedom, but particularly for those who have lost their lives and are suffering for freedom of religion. Thank you. Before we get started, we're going to show you a 10-minute short film which was produced by one of our panelists, Colby Barrett. As a Protestant Christian, Colby was shocked at the violence Russian forces were inflicting on Ukrainian Christians, particularly evangelicals. The upcoming documentary, he's taken action by producing this film, and the upcoming documentary is called A Faith Under Siege, and it aims to get at the truth of the matter. The film focuses on Russia's acts of brutality, torture, forced exorcism of Ukrainian Protestants, and the kidnapping and militarization of nearly 20,000 Ukrainian orphans, many of whom were taken from church-run orphanages. My blood's already boiling. I'm sure yours will after you will see this film. And then we'll bring our panelists to the stage.
So many people were leaving, trying to escape the Russians. Why did you decide to stay?
Я, можливо, вас здивую трошки, да. Ну, по-перше, Господь не випустив нас. В Херсон я приїхав в 96-му році. Це була така ситуація, я колись був залежною людиною, і там почав ходити до церкви, навернувся до Бога, і пастор виїхав за кордон, а мені подарував невеликий будиночок і кусочок землі, і далі там я вже будувався. Там з'явилась наша родина. Це селище для мене стало дійсно рідним. Да, до відкритої фази війни наша церква налічувала десь близько 50 людей.
Коли почалася війна, на заправках, до заправок були великі пробки, неможливо було просто проїхати. І потім при виїзді з Миколаєва великі колони стояли з Херсону. Люди виїздили.
І коли почалося вторгнення росіян, ми вже розуміли, що вони підходять близько до Херсона. І насправді страшно. Це страшно і дуже боляче. Дуже боляче. Я сказав своїй родині, вже на вечір було виїздити пізно, я сказав, давайте будемо молитись до ранку, щоб Господь дав нам чітку відповідь, що робити далі. Більше того, під час цієї молитви я дивився на свій будинок, який побудував, на телевізор, який тільки купив. Мені було дуже шкода все це кидати. І вранці, коли ми встали, у мене була одна ясна думка в голові. Господь мені сказав: залишайся, я буду берегти тебе і твою родину. Особливо перші місяці окупації були важкими, бо ми міли, що ми будемо їсти, де брати продукти і так далі.
Того, що багато людей було, яких забирали.
Everybody in Kherson has a story about torture.
Мого сусіда забрали. Його досі невідома його судьба, де він, що з ним.
They call it being taken to the basement. It's a euphemism for torture. Everybody's got a friend or themselves that was taken to the basement. And it was especially true for church leaders.
All across Russian-occupied Ukraine, soldiers are shutting down places of worship.
Russian forces are closing churches and persecuting Christians.
Багато церков позакривалося. Росіяни були практично у всіх церквах Херсона. Вони заходили, вони спілкувались. Я знаю пасторів, у яких дітей заарештовували, і таким чином чинили на них тиск.
When Kherson was occupied, just holding church services was so risky. But some pastors were brave enough to do it anyway.
Даруй нам силу, визволитись від окупантів, вижени московитів з нашої землі, захисти наш народ. Амінь.
Амінь.
Я розумів, що людям треба якась підтримка і відчуття стабільності. Ми почали проводити служіння. В цей час було дуже моторошно і дуже страшно. Коли ти проповідуєш, говориш, молишся за визволення України. Вони саме з 5 до 6 години приходили з обшуками і так далі. Я кожен день, десь о 5 годині, я просинався, вставав, щоб, якщо прийдуть, то щоб я був як мінімум одягнений. Що можуть прийти. Але от Господь як сказав, що Він захистить.
І вони, коли йшли по вулиці, вони заходили в кожен будинок, а до нас вони не заходили.
І він це зробив. Ні одного разу ні один росіянин не зайшов або до мене додому, або в церкву. Це те, що я вважаю величезним дивом Божим просто.
Now to stunning new developments in the war in Ukraine. Yesterday, Russia announced its forces would withdraw from the southern city of Kherson and the surrounding area.
A humiliating defeat for Vladimir Putin.
І коли наші війська зайшли в Херсон, це була ейфорія волі, визволення.
This place where I'm standing was occupied by the Russians. And now it's not. Unfortunately, the Russians didn't go very far. They're still right across the river from Kherson.
The Dnieper River divides Kherson with the left bank controlled by Russian forces and the right by Ukrainians. Kherson is a city under siege.
Civilians are now living with a daily onslaught of Russian shelling.
In Kherson, at least 10 are dead and 58 injured in a strike on Christmas Eve.
Так, це було 24 грудня 2022 року. Якраз Різдвяне свято для дітей ми робили. Опіль Віваро – це перша автівка, яка була попала під обстріл такий. Десь приблизно 15 серпня. І ми стояли кружком у дворі, ми молились якраз. І під час цієї молитви, у нас гості були, там я почув, як ми молились, він полетів. Мабуть, був пустий, але от за 2 дні повернувся, і в це саме місце, де ми стояли, де молилися, там стояло моє авто, в це саме місце він просто скинув вибухів. Потім 2 тижні пройшло. Ми їхали з дітьми в мікроавтобусі, і вони вдарили по автівці. Граната пробила дах, поранила нас. Це десь приблизно за кілометр від мого дому. Ми просто поїхали додому, і коли вже під'їжджали додому, то діти мої сказали мені, що дрон
супроводжує нас. Відкрили ворота, ми заскочили одразу в гараж, закрили гараж і послухали, він завис просто над нашим будинком. Ми викликали швидку, але коли діти сказали, що тату, там дрон і вже не 1, а 2, то я швидку відмовив. Тобто я зателефонував, сказав, не їдьте, бо вони зараз очікують, що приїде допомога. І коли зрозуміли, що не буде нічого, я вже і просто тоді кинули прямо на дах мого будинку і потрапили саме в ту кімнату, де ми в цей час перев'язувалися, де я перев'язував дітей. Тобто таких випадків взагалі було 5 намагань.
In the midst of it all, Ukrainian Christians are risking their lives to serve those trapped by war.
Приїхав, слава Богу, тебе дорогой. Я дуже радий тебе бачити в Одесі.
Листопада 22-го року, коли сталося визволення Херсона, нашу церкву в середньому кожне недільне служіння відвідують близько 500-550 людей.
When you think about what's really going on here, Russia is torturing and murdering Ukrainian Christians for their faith. Leaving the house is dangerous. Going to church for a Sunday service is dangerous. Russia is trying to break the will of these people, but they can't do it.
Якби я не відчував себе свободною істотою, я б ніколи не залишився. Я б в страху тікав би звідти, і так далі. Але ми не можемо, як християни, забитись в куточок і жити там. Ми продовжуємо жити. Насправді, те, чому я зараз в Херсоні і за що я веду боротьбу, це за славу Божу і це за волю українців.
Бо бували випадки, коли було по 700 людей, там були люди всіх деномінацій. І люди, які просто приходять з світського життя. Да. Просто дім молитви повний, двір повний, 1, 2 дворика, і всюди люди, ми виносили колонки, щоб люди чули. Більше того, навіть сусіди казали, як класно, що ви винесли колонки. Ми сидимо вдома і чуємо все.
Звичайно. По-іншому не можна.
Ти ніде не знаходишся.
Thank you, everyone. Let me introduce our panel. First, I'll start with Colby Barrett, who's the executive producer of the documentary film Faith Under Siege. Colby is an entrepreneur and filmmaker who previously served as captain in the United States Marine Corps, where he led both infantry and scout sniper platoons throughout the Pacific Rim and Middle East as part of various operations, including Noble Eagle and Enduring Freedom. Colby also holds a law degree from Yale Law School, and most recently led a $1 billion plus business as its CEO. And Colby, thank you very, very much for that really inspiring film. Really greatly appreciated. Reverend Johnny Moore is a global evangelical leader best known for his consequential work at the intersection of faith and foreign policy, especially in the Middle East. Reverend Moore is routinely listed among the world's most influential religious figures. He is a popular author, teacher, and acclaimed human rights and religious freedom activist whose effective advocacy has materially impacted policy in many nations. Reverend Moore has a number of awards and honors, including the Simon Wiesenthal Center's prestigious Medal of Valor, and he was twice appointed to the U.S. Commission for International Religious Freedom by the 45th President and now 47th President of the United States, Donald Trump. Stephen Moore, founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project, Stephen Moore has spent 7 years as a Republican leadership chief of staff in the U.S. House of Representatives. He came to Ukraine on day 5 of the war to help. His NGO, the Ukraine Freedom Project, started as a humanitarian organization, delivering several $1 million worth of goods to areas impacted by the war. With his years of experience on Capitol Hill, Steve has become a trusted source of firsthand, data-driven information to members of Congress and their staff. As one example, the UFP team conceived and drove the campaign highlighting Russia's systemic torture and murder of Ukraine's evangelical Christians in occupied parts of Ukraine in support of the April 2024 Ukraine aid bill. UFP visited almost 100 congressional offices and ran advocacy campaigns in key districts. Ryan Lane is the Ukraine country manager for Samaritans Purse International, a non-denominational Christian nonprofit organization from North Carolina, whose mission is to provide physical and spiritual aid to people in need of it around the world. Their 150-strong team in Ukraine has been distributing aid to those most in need across the frontline areas of the war since the start of the full-scale invasion. And Ola Kba, founder of Save Ukraine, and formerly Ukraine's Commissioner for Children's Rights from 2014 to 2021. He is a Ukrainian social and political activist and former presidential commissioner for children's rights. With over 25 years' experience advocating for children's rights, Ola is globally recognized as a child protection expert and has received several international awards for his work, including the Oxy Courage Award and the Monhay Peace Award in 2023. And Ola, for those of you who have seen recently children who have been returned to Ukraine, those among the 20,000 who have been kidnapped, it is Save Ukraine that has been crucial in making sure that those children are returned home. And finally, me, I'm your moderator. You may be wondering what's a girl like me moderating a panel like this for. But early in my career, I was actually the press officer for the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church while it was in exile, and was part of the team that came back to Ukraine in 1991 to help rebuild that church. And I think that all of us who know anything about the religious situation in Ukraine understand that Russia historically has persecuted an independent Ukrainian Orthodox Church, persecuted the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, has persecuted members of the Jewish community, and has persecuted those of the evangelical and Christian faiths for centuries. What we see in history was a precursor of what is happening today. And what's important is for that message to get out, that this is not a one-off. This is something that has been done for a long time, and it must stop. So Steve, I'm going to start with you. Tell me, why is it important for us today to take this message, particularly to the United States, in support of Ukraine? How will that help the United States better support Ukraine going forward?
Thank you for that. What a lot of folks don't know, if you're not kind of in the midst of Republican politics in the United States, is that evangelical Christians in America are a very powerful political force. And they make about 40% of Trump's voting bloc. But they're also the most active and vocal part of the Republican coalition. So, like Trump voters started out in March of 2022 with like 3/4 of them thought we should send aid to Ukraine. Now that's like down in the teens, particularly among evangelical Christians. And why is that? Because it's a bunch of reasons. One is that there's just no one showing up to talk to these people. No one is getting into that communication cycle. And so Ukraine becomes someplace far away that I don't know anything about, and those people talk funny. And so what we're doing, and actually the people that are showing up to talk to them are Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Steve Bannon, and people who are out and out lying about what's happening in Ukraine. They're repeating the Kremlin message. So why it's important, this film, because we're telling American Christians, American evangelical Christians, that people who choose to worship God in the very, that's a very personal decision. People who choose to worship God the way they do are dying to be able to do it. They're facing imprisonment. And so what we found is we ran a campaign last year. Anna Shvetsova, who was here, there she is, right there, is our chief operating officer. She's the Ukrainian that knows the most people working on Capitol Hill. But we ran a campaign last year that helped Speaker Johnson get an emotional and spiritual connection to Ukraine. Speaker Johnson was a Baptist activist prior to getting sworn into Congress. So, the CIA briefings gave him the intellectual information about why Ukraine's important, but we were able to give him that emotional and spiritual connection to Ukraine. And that's important not only at that congressional level, but at the grassroots level.
Reverend Moore, I'd like to come to you. Help us understand how the evangelical community in the United States today understands what's happening in Ukraine, if it does broadly. And what is it that we need to be doing more of to be able to gain more support, to be able to take this message to them?
Well, first of all, I just want to commend everyone involved in organizing this for shining a light on the role of faith actors in our world. I would say it's not one of the top topics that Davos is known for, and yet there's this mysterious phenomena about evangelical Christians, and that is they're actually quite informed about the world. When President Trump won the election in 2016, in his first term, if you looked at the issues that motivated evangelical turnout the most, like the top 5 issues, 2 or 3 of those issues were foreign policy related issues, and so. We know about the evangelical church in the Islamic Republic of Iran, for instance. We grew up hearing these stories about the struggle. We stay connected to them. We know about the evangelical church in Ukraine. It's actually one of the fastest growing evangelical movements certainly in all of this continent, but in the world. So I remember as a young evangelical, at our church every year, you would have a group of evangelicals that would come from Ukraine to our congregation, and so there's this like unbelievable network that has existed in that part of Europe that pre-existed this war. And I think it's really, really important to recognize that what you saw in this film here is indicative of our community. We don't start wars, we can't stop wars, but what we can do is we can decide to play our part in the middle of the crisis. And there is no question that however this war ends, I think we can predict it is going. I'm not going to put a timetable on it, but it is going to end. And there's sort of one major shift. I would say that the forthcoming Trump administration views the conflict more through the eyes of the human cost of the war, and the way that the Biden administration viewed it more through the geostrategic nature of the conflict. These are 2 different lenses. But when it comes to the human cost of the war, however the war ends, when history writes about this moment, some of those who have lost the most are the evangelicals of Ukraine. And yet, some of the greatest heroes in the middle of this war, those who decided to stay when they could have left in order to serve at great risk to themselves, will be the evangelical community. Because these Christians that you saw in this video, unlike many Christians in the West, perhaps, are willing to die for a faith that most of us barely practice. And this is a story that will resonate with our community. It already is.
Thank you. Colby, what made you decide to spend your time, your energy, your money to develop this film and to tell this story? Give us a little bit of history. What moved you?
Yeah, so I was home in Colorado this summer. I got a phone call from a friend that I went to law school with, and he said, "Hey, I'm organizing an aid convoy to Ukraine. Do you want to come?" And my answer was no. I have 4 kids. I'm very comfortable here. It's dangerous there. But one of the things that, as you follow your faith, sometimes what you want to do isn't what happens. And I felt my heart and my mind being pulled to Ukraine. So we jumped on this aid convoy, brought 25 vehicles in, $1 million worth of supplies with a nonprofit called Zero Line. And in the organization discussion around that convoy, somebody said, it's really important to tell stories of what we see over there. And I thought that was a really good thing to say, and I've got 600 Instagram followers, so man, I was gonna get the word out. And I started researching a little bit about what are those stories over there. And you know, the stats on what's happening to Christians over there is just, it's shocking. We were just discussing the number of churches that are looted, destroyed, or seized by the Russians as they came in, and the number has gone from 630 to 650. There's new information that's coming out to add to that. The number of faith leaders killed just went from 48 to 49. Thousands of churches shut down, and then if you view in Free Ukraine, in terms of just Protestant churches, almost 9,000 left. And so there's a big concept of making sure we tell the stories of those that have suffered under this, but also protect those that are still there trying to practice their faith. So we put together a really good documentary team in Ukraine and then in New York to do the post-production. And the film should be done around February 4th is the time frame. What you saw was a short. We talked to over 40 people. And these stories were just amazing, like you saw with Pastor Ola. We couldn't get everything into the documentary, and we also wanted to honor these people. And so we made these shorts for people that either didn't make it in or their story wasn't fully brought out there. So that was a good way to get the message out. So.
Where are you thinking to show the documentary? Because I think we all understand that the purpose of this is to be able to help, particularly in the U.S., where, you know, unfortunately, I think we all agree, somehow there has come across this very skewed image of Vladimir Putin with a small v and a small p, who is a great defender of the faith somehow, and that he is this wonderful human being who is defending Christian values. So I think it's really critically important. It's an uphill battle because Russian propaganda has been really strong and really effective. And if there's one thing that the Russians additionally put money behind, it's about disinformation and propaganda. They've been very effective. So tell us where and I'm hoping that you're going to tell me that you're going to partner with Reverend Johnny. You're going to show it at all of his churches.
As I mentioned, in a past life, I was a CEO, and when we did strategic planning, we always had something called a big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAG, right? And so for this movie, we said, everybody in America sees this. Look, I know that's not going to happen, so my minor BHAG is every Christian in America sees this. So church screenings and those kind of things are really the highlight of our strategy, and it's a little bit different than most films. Most films are, you know, business ventures that try to make money. This is something that's trying to bring attention to this issue at a very critical time. So some of the normal routes of film festivals and those kind of things is not really as applicable, but our big ask is we want to show this film everywhere, and especially to Christians in the U.S. So if anybody's out there, it's a faithundersiege.com. And there's a deal there where you can post screenings and host screenings. So we'd love to get any help with that. We want everybody to see this. So,
Thank you. And
Yeah.
and I want to go to Mikola now, because I know that a big part of your documentary, Colby, is about the children who have been kidnapped, many of them actually from Christian orphanages. And although within this panel we're very much focused on evangelical and on Baptist churches and Christian churches in Ukraine at this moment in time, we all certainly know that the Russian terror in the occupied territories has not been simply reserved for them. But this is a very critical key, we believe, to reaching the American public at this point in time. So, Mikola, help us understand, your evangelical faith is actually a big part of the work that you do with Ukrainian children. And Save Ukraine does so much in terms of trying to help people integrate themselves back into Ukrainian society. Tell us about the reception that you have received, because you travel a lot to try to be a messenger of what it is that's happening in Ukraine. Tell us the kind of reception you've had with Americans when you're telling them that Russians are kidnapping Ukrainian children, and particularly what are American evangelicals saying? Because I do believe that the story of these 20,000 children being kidnapped is not one that has really received a lot of traction globally. So tell us about some of the feedback that you've received.
Thank you, Sonia. I think children, it's the best way how we can explain what happened with Ukraine. Because Putin systematically annihilate our identity. He's destroying. He won't destroy us as a nation. And yeah, you're right. I started my ministry maybe 26 years ago in my church. I am evangelical. Yeah, and I have a lot of friends all over the world, especially in the United States. And it's a question for me, how American evangelicals will protect Ukrainian evangelicals and Ukrainian children. I have no idea, because sometimes this discussion between interests, it is not biblical discussion. It is not about values. It's about strategic interests. We will never find ourselves in American strategic interests. You know, that survey shows that Americans care more about Ukrainian titanium than about how to protect Ukrainian children. Craziness. Yeah, and really, last year I studied in Congress with 5 abducted children who've been returned by Save Ukraine. By the way, yesterday we returned 4 more children who've been abducted.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And I can show you emotions of older sister. She met 2 hours ago in Kiev her younger, 13 years old sister. I think it's hard to explain, but if American evangelicals could see this picture,
So, Ryan, question to you. Your work is predominantly focused on humanitarian relief, but you work through churches. When did you start hearing about some of the horrors faced by Christians in Ukraine? And what did you see? And again, very, very grateful to Samaritans Purse for not only being a source of humanitarian aid to the needy in Ukraine. And I know that you're non-denominational and you're helping anybody who needs some help. But also, I think what you're doing through your organization and through your broader organization, trying to tell the story of what's happening in Ukraine, is also very commendable. So tell us a bit about that, please.
Yeah, thank you. So for Samaritans Purse, we work internationally in many different countries. And we have 2 kind of primary focuses in our mission. And one is to assist anyone and everyone who is in need. anyone. Like, we have no basis on who it is we help. We help everyone. And then the second is to empower and enrich the church anywhere that we go. There are some places that we go where there is no church, and so that's one proposition. And then there are places that we go, like Ukraine, where there is a thriving church. And so those two goals that we have in our mission dovetail very, very well in Ukraine, because there's so many churches. Not only are there so many churches, but those churches, as the Reverend mentioned before, are often the ones who are staying. So when you have a community that is out there on the front lines, where there are civilians who have decided to stay, then the people who are best equipped to help those people already are the local churches who have remained. And so for us, when we came in as an organization on the day after the full-scale invasion and said we want to help people and we want to empower the church, then we were flooded with thousands of churches that were coming and saying, we want to be out there on the front lines helping. And that is I've been in the field for a very long time. That's a new one for me, to have that response within the communities that you're helping, that are actually going to be those kind of grassroots frontline arms and legs and hands and feet. And so for us in Ukraine, we mentioned, we have 150 staff members there, which is a significant amount of staff members, but we would need thousands of staff members to directly implement all of what we do. We're distributing hundreds of thousands of tons of food, hundreds of millions of liters of water, shelter, and medicine, and all of these things to civilians out on the front lines. And that final mile is done by the churches themselves. So we have turned ourselves into a massive logistical operation, working with hundreds of churches that are already out there that are doing that final mile distribution. And they are some of the bravest people that I have ever met in my entire life, that are constantly going. And everything that we can do to protect them and equip them, we do. Ultimately, we are all there for the same mission, which is to help save the lives and give both physical and spiritual aid to as many people in Ukraine as we possibly can. And our primary focus is the red zone. It is the frontline areas. So kind of all of that is good background to the kind of prime question you're asking there. And just a little bit more background to that is, when you're talking about churches, we all kind of understand the denominational element. So, you have denominations, groupings of churches, and then you have the churches themselves. And one of the unique aspects in Ukraine is the diaspora that has been created by the war is particularly pronounced in the church. And so you have churches that are inside of occupied territories, and some of those people are still there. But some of them left. And some of them left and are now living in the frontline areas. And some of them left and are now living in Western Ukraine. And some of them left and are now in Poland or Germany or the United States or Canada. And then you have other churches in that denomination that are connected to them. So there is an unbroken chain of churches, not just denominations, but actual churches, where their congregation is spread out from occupied territory to red zone, to Western Ukraine, to Germany and Poland, and to the United States. And we work with them in every one of those places. We have different work, and it looks very different. But so, when communications come out of the churches in occupied territories, this is not what I consider to be second or third-hand information, right? This is consistent, direct information that's coming from church members to other church members that gets communicated directly to us. So, when you're asking how and when and what does it look like when we're learning about the persecution of churches by Russia in occupied territories, it was immediate. It was immediate, but we didn't necessarily recognize it for what it was. At least I didn't. We, as an American organization, hearing about the things that are coming out, it's difficult to actually kind of disaggregate that a bit from the general horribleness that is happening to people who are living there versus very specific targeted persecution of churches. But some of the things that started to come out were things that made me kind of perk up my ears and say, they mentioned it in the movie, but forced, coming to people and saying there's a demon in you.
Yes.
And exorcisms
Forced
and things, forced exorcisms,
of
and things of that nature that are happening that are just odd enough that it makes you inquire further. And I think the primary thing, my primary takeaway from all of that, as we really dove into it and learned more about what was happening with the churches there was it was a huge surprise to me. It was not a surprise to any of my Ukrainian staff. And this, I think, is something we go back to again and again and again when we're helping American evangelicals understand what is happening, understanding that to them, it's an almost inconceivable notion that one group of Christians that they would perceive to be Christians would be persecuting another group of Christians in this manner. It just doesn't compute. It's not an automatic assumption that we have. And so when you really delve into what's happening, there's so much historical basis for it in near and far history with the Soviet Union and everything like that, that it's a baseline assumption from a lot of Ukrainians. Of course, this is happening. That was always what was going to happen.
Right.
And then it even doubles down on the difficulty of the communication because a lot of Ukrainians, I think, don't understand the degree to which that needs to be explained to American evangelicals.
And how
because
difficult it is to explain it,
Yes.
because you don't want to believe that the Russians are capable of something like that. Reverend, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I'll just add two points. First of all, I want everyone to appreciate how large the evangelical community actually is. It's not just, it's 40% of the Republican base, but that's, it's about 80 million Americans. Okay, it's the single largest voting bloc in the United States of America. But it's about 800 million people around the world.
Right.
Okay, so there are more evangelicals, for instance, in China than there are members of the Communist Party of China. This is the second largest Christian community all around the world. And it's not just an American movement. Brazil is majority evangelical now. You have evangelical movements actually all over this continent, growing churches all over this continent. And so I think it's very, very important to understand the scale of this community. That's observation number one. Observation number two. One of the things that's so painful about all of this is that when you read our history, we, the evangelicals, stood with the traditional churches when they were being persecuted in the Soviet era. Okay, when Billy Graham, controversially crossed the Iron Curtain and made the president of the United States incredibly angry, one of the reasons why he did that was to be an advocate for persecuted people. Yes. And one of the tragedies about all of this is, unfortunately, those whom we spoke for are not speaking for us now. And I think that this is, and I'm not sure, certainly the case here, that people don't understand the sheer power of the evangelical community around the world. Evangelicals mainly want to be left alone and practice our religious freedom. But when we decide to involve ourselves in the political process, we make a difference.
Yes.
And a Republican cannot win in the United States of America without the evangelical community. And by the way, that's going to be increasingly the case in other countries of the world.
Yes.
So just some additional context.
And very, very grateful because you have kindly set Steve up for my next question. So taking this into consideration, Steve, and I think all of us here understanding that we really need to get it together and we have to be able to focus on communicating what is happening on the religious front in Ukraine with many faiths, particularly in the evangelical community. What do we need to do to be able to get that message, to empower Reverend Johnny, to be able to empower, to put that message across in the American community today, to be able to harness that political power that Reverend Johnny just mentioned in order to be able to increase support for Ukraine?
Well, it's a matter of communication. And, I've run political campaigns all my life in about a dozen different countries around the world. And, what I've seen is that, if you look for a message and you test it on a survey, you look for messages that can convince people. When people see this film, when people get the messages that are in this film, we've tested it. 7 out of 10 American evangelical Christians who vote Republican are more likely to support Ukraine when they see this, when they hear these messages. So if we show it to 10 people, 7 of them will become more favorable towards Ukraine. If we show it to 100 people, 70 of them will become more favorable towards Ukraine. I want to show it to millions of people. Yeah, and so so what we need is partners. What we need are people who are willing to pitch in with this. So so there's all of us on this stage have risked our lives in the red zone in Ukraine to get this message out. And so we're putting our lives on the line, we're putting our treasure on the line, and we need folks to come in with us and invest with us.
So when I was still working in the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, one of the things that we did, and I'm going to put down a suggestion at this moment. One of the most important things that we did, we brought delegations of Vatican journalists into Ukraine so that they could meet with the priests who were in the underground, so that they could understand how the church had been persecuted. So, Reverend, I'm going to suggest to you, very kindly, I'm going to suggest to everyone on the stage, let's bring together some of the power of the evangelical media, some of the most important leaders in the evangelical movement. Many of us on this stage live in Ukraine. We would love to be able to bring you in so that firsthand you would be able to understand this, so that you can take the message of what's happening in Ukraine directly back to the United States and to be able to influence. We'd be happy to host.
What are you doing next week?
We have a biblical admonition that says if one member of the body of Christ suffers, we all suffer.
Yes.
And so whether it's a persecuted Christian in Ukraine or in any country of the world, we have an obligation to experience suffering with them. And I think the power of what I just saw here, as I said earlier, it makes the human component come alive in a conversation that's too much about geopolitics sometimes. It's like guaranteed to go viral. I mean, the amount of compassion that our community has for the persecuted church all around the world. And also, we need to, as I said before, we need to recognize some of these people as heroes. Many of them, the last thing they wanted was war in any direction. The one thing they want to do is get out. And yet they stay and they serve those in need, whomever they are. And we also can't forget those stories. But it's their faith that's doing it.
Yes.
And by the way, just as a general rule, be smarter to work with religious organizations. I mean, there isn't a Starbucks or a McDonald's in every town in the world, but there's a church there. And they know everybody in their community, and they know what their needs are, and that's what makes Samaritans Purse's work so important.
Thank you for that, Reverend. And before we finish, I know we're trying to make up a little bit of time, but if there are any questions from the audience, yes. Ladies first or Dan first?
You have to get ready. Okay. I'll be filler. Dan Bilak from Kiev, Ukraine. This is a great panel, and I really thank all of you for the work that you're doing. A quick question. One of the things in terms of Ukrainians are very, very bad in terms of getting their story across to the rest of the world. It's been an ongoing problem for many, many years. And Steve, you and I have talked about this, that perhaps one of the ways to contextualize, because that's important. It's not just about there are some evangelical churches in Ukraine that are being persecuted. Maybe the context, this is a question for all of you, is explain to Americans and American evangelicals in particular that Ukraine is the Bible Belt of Europe. This is the most fertile religious ground in all, certainly in Eastern Europe. Well, the Poles would argue, but they have a different issue. And I think that's a really important contextual, because it means that it's not just about what we have now, but all the possibility of what can be in the future. And to bring both Ukrainian evangelicals and American evangelicals and Ukrainian people and Americans and Ukraine and America closer together. So I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
I'll just say one quick thing. From a spiritual perspective, from a geopolitical perspective, Ukraine started out fighting the Russians, then the Iranians, then the North Koreans. And China is underwriting it all. What do all those places have in common? They are the most godless countries in the world. North Korea worships Kim Jong-un, you know? So why, from a spiritual perspective, what is happening in Ukraine, the breadbasket of Christianity in Europe? What is happening there that these dark forces are so intent on destroying?
I would add to that. So it is the Bible Belt of Europe, but they send out missionaries all over. So it's not just Americans coming and preaching and converting Ukrainians, it's Ukrainians then going out, especially the post-Soviet republics. I would echo your point about Ukrainians being bad about telling their story. So Pastor Ola, when we met him, he wanted to talk about how his church was growing and these kind of things. It was only after the interview, when we saw his car, we saw it was destroyed. He's still driving this minivan around. It was his third destroyed minivan. And we're like, you should have led with that, man. So just a great point of that. Yeah, it was like, and so we had to actually go back and we had to interview him twice to finally get this story. It's not that he was reluctant to tell it, but he wanted to talk about his church growing, not what was happening. It was a humble kind of concept. So it was, we got the story out, but it was two trips.
I also I would like to give a very practical tip. Okay. It's also important how Ukrainians speak about the war, because we also have evangelicals in Russia. We have underground evangelicals in North Korea and Iran. As evangelicals, we don't have permission to not love anyone. Okay? As evangelicals, our goal is to reach everyone. We believe every human being is made in the image of God. And so I think we have to also, there's this delicate balance between speaking clearly and justly about, it's clear who the aggressor was in this conflict, but it's also very, very important that when the Ukrainian community speaks about the aggressors, the Russians, that Ukrainians don't speak about all Russians as being, you know, indicative of this. It's the same thing when I'm very, very burdened over Iran. In fact, one day I traveled all the way to the border of Iran, and I looked over the river separating Iran from another country, and I read Psalm 91, and I prayed for the people in Iran. I love the Iranian people, and I hate what the Iranian regime does to them. And so I think, you know, there's a nuance here. Don't pull. Our community is quite informed when it comes to geopolitics. I mean, you know, there are lots and lots of evangelicals in this Trump administration. There are plenty in the other. We know what we're talking about. And yet on the same token, have some nuance, because we don't want to be brought into every conflict. We want to support our brothers and our sisters. We want to stand for truth. We believe in just war, particularly when it comes to self-defense. We believe there are just offensive wars. But we also want to see a future for the Russians, as well as for Ukraine to recover everything that has been lost and rebuild a future. We pray, we worship the Prince of Peace. And so these are things to balance as well.
Thank you for that, Reverend. Yes,
So,
Catherine.
I
Mikola, please.
Yeah, I want to add something. It's really hard to communicate with the American audience, really. Every day, we try to find any messages. It's hard. Being Ukrainian, it's really hard because many Americans have no idea about our stories. Very often I ask about Holodomor. Many of them have no idea what it is. Holodomor? Yeah, they don't understand, many of them, not all. You guys know well, but many of them really don't understand. That's why we're trying to find a way how to convince Americans that we are like separate. We are not Russian people. We are Ukrainians. We want to have independence. And let me give you some numbers. For the last 10 years, half of our children's population disappeared. Half. It's about a plan of Putin how destroy us all. Half. 1.6 million for the last 10 years, Donbass, Crimea, new occupied territories live under the Russians. Almost all of them have Russian passports, indoctrinated, and thousands of them, as a young adults, fighting against us because Russia instilled hatred towards Ukraine. It's clear. And that children who stays in Ukraine suffer because A, raid, shelling, stress, and the last thing, if before full-scale invasion, we had birth death rate 2 to 1. 2 died, 1 burned. Now 3 died, 1 burned. And every year, almost 500,000 dying. Every year. And only maybe 160, 70 children appear. We are dying as a nation. And now Ukrainian diaspora may be bigger than Ukrainians who live internally. And it is Putin's plan how to destroy us at all. We have to understand it.
Yep. I think it goes back to our earlier discussion around the Russians investing very, very heavily in terms of getting their messages out through their propaganda. And I think that that's something, that's a big learning for us as Ukrainians. We have to step up and we have to do that as well. Catherine, please, and then we have to end, I think.
So I just want to thank each and every one of you. I am the granddaughter of 4 survivors of Holodomor, and they told us the day that their homes were seized, they were thrown out, their lands were seized, and then they were made to go to the church and watch their priests shot in the head, their cupolas, the gold taken out, and sold and to melted down to buy equipment to build the Soviet Union. So in many ways, this is about faith, this is about destruction of nation, but this is also about money. And so let's talk about money, because what I'm hearing is, you need money, you need money, you need money. You're okay. You need money. Okay? So I mean, Nicola has told me $10,000 US dollars to save every Ukrainian kidnapped child. That's what it takes. So we're sitting on 350 billion in Russian frozen assets, and we have Yulia Ziskina here. Do we have Yulia Ziskina? Who is literally has made it her mission to gather economists, lawyers, professionals around the world to make this happen. And her own story is that her grandparents died in Holodomor, Babyn Yar, and her grandfather just recently in occupied Berdyansk. So we're going to get this done. Something has changed recently, people. They've gone from securities held by Europe to cash, which means that the cash held in US currency can now be seized by the US government. And the bills and legislation are in place. The US can do this now. There's a precedent with Iran in the 70s. Bank of England held it in trust. We could have reparations and money for victims, money for rebuilding churches, money for saving children, and we could have this now, and all it requires is political will. So I guess my question, it's more of a informing everybody, because this is a hot topic. We have a panel on this on Thursday. My question is, how do we make that happen? How do we get US evangelicals to insist to Trump to seize those Russian assets now, and as quickly as possible to help rebuild Ukraine and bring justice now?
I could just add to that. When we were in Izium, we met a Baptist pastor whose church had been destroyed, completely destroyed. They had to hide in a basement for 30 days once the shelling stopped. We gave him $1,000. He built a little shed next to his church, and that's where they worship now. It's just plywood. But going there and seeing that, Anya went there and saw the joy, the faith in that community for having a shed now instead of a burned out church was huge. And if that money could actually rebuild some of these churches, the impact on the faith community, on the community there in general, would be a pretty big deal. You saw this with Ola. 20% of the people that come to his church aren't Christians. They're there for a message of hope, of stability, and they're from the secular world. So that money could go to some good places, and it wouldn't just be to help Christians, it would be to help these communities.
Thank you all. I know that we've, I'm sorry? No.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, okay. No, I'm sorry. I thought you wanted us to get off the stage. I apologize.
Usually the organizers are not telling you to stay on
stage. Yeah. No, I thought you wanted us to get off. I apologize. Sorry.
I also think we, but a slightly contrarian point, I think we think too much about the government being the solution to all of these problems. The government can do things only the government can do. I'm not diminishing that reality. But I think our global Christian community can take care of rebuilding the churches and supporting these Christians. You know, I wrote a 600-page book on the stories of Christian martyrs, updating a historic text called Fox's Book of Martyrs. I have several Christian martyrs from the Soviet era in that book, and like one of the things that we can do to make sure that people understand there's a difference between being Ukrainian and Russian. Is that we can tell the stories of our brave Ukrainian brothers and sisters in Christ who chose to stay when everyone left. And to save a life is to save the whole world, according to our Jewish brothers and sisters. And so I think we need this type of partnership, and I am sure our community will care a lot. And this shows what happens, by the way, when an individual cares and decides to tell a powerful story. And so that's what we saw today, is something worth celebrating by all of us.
Yes. Thank you. And I want to give a very, very special thanks to Ukraine House for actually having this panel today, because this is such an critically important issue that just is not really known and understood. So thank you, really, hats off.